All right, hi there. Brandon here with the Shift Project and CrossFit Surge. I want to touch on a topic that gets a lot of debate even still nowadays, you guys, and that's the topic of calories. You can talk about this as calorie in, calorie out. Is calorie counting going to elicit long-term benefits? Is it going to elicit long-term sustainable results? All right, now there's a lot of specific words I've just threw in there for specific reasons, and I'll get into that here in a second. But first, before we get into that, I think it's important to understand first off, what is a calorie? All right, now calorie, all it is, you can call it kilocalorie, is essentially it's a measure, it's a unit of energy. All right, so back in the day, way back in the day, the way they used to essentially estimate calories on how they used to estimate how much value food has was they would put food or an object into what they called a bomb calometer, and so what they would do is they'd put the object in. So say they put a piece of cheese in there, and then they would surround it by water. Now what they would do then is they would proceed by burning it. Now when they burned it, they would essentially measure the temperature of the water and see how much that water raised by burning the object that they just got done burning. And so depending on how much the temperature elevated, they would calculate how many calories that piece of food or whatever would actually elicit in calories. And so by doing that, you go, so essentially it's thermogenics. Okay, so essentially it's a measure of thermogenics of based off of that. Now, the newer method, more recent method of what they've kind of transitioned to, and it's based off of the National Data Lab Association. You can look this up for the USDA, but essentially they've turned to what they call is the Atwater system. Now, what that does is it basically tallies the amount or calculates the amount of calories based off of the carbohydrates, the protein, and the fat that are in the food that is listed, and then they essentially also subtract fiber out of that because that affects the carbohydrate absorption rate for food. Now, why this is important is because depending on where they're getting it, food can have, especially when you're taking it from the thermogenic aspect of when it was burnt, the food can be, I've seen anywhere between 10 up to 25% plus or minus the amount of calories based off of where that calculation was taken from. So even though that measure may not even be correct on that. Now, getting far in the rabbit hole on this, okay, so the reason why I think it's first to understand, so that's a calorie, okay? Now, when it comes to calorie counting, okay, now, what we have seen, we've been working with clients for almost 20 years based around these things, and we've seen a lot of different approaches taken. We've done a lot of different approaches for ourselves, and calories, and I'm gonna kind of preference this of, are calories important? Yes, they are. Okay, now that's a unit of measurement. Now it's a calculation of your sum total of what you are consuming on a daily basis, but it is, in my opinion, not very vital. All right, now the part that I want to really dial home on and kind of get out there is everything that we do in our body is a system. Everything in our body talks to another system to make sure it's functioning and properly doing its job, right? Like my heart just doesn't beat because it's my heart. My heart beats because my nervous system. It beats because of my brain, because the oxygen I'm consuming, because of the other hormonal things that are going on through my body, right? Like my stomach doesn't just digest food based off of certain things. It comes from my liver. It comes from my kidneys. It comes from other functioning happening between my brain and those two things connecting. So I first want to make sure I can't overstate the importance of understanding that everything that we do is based off of a system operating off of one another component inside our body. Okay, now why this is important is because when we eat food, all right, so if we're talking about fitness and health, when we're talking about consumption of nutrients or nourishing our body or following a diet or whatever, even by me speaking certain foods, right? Like if I start talking about cookies or donuts or whatever, in preparation for that, by just me saying those words, my brain automatically has a certain interpretation of those things and automatically creates a certain response in my body. And so what happens on there, by me just saying or thinking about those things, you can tell I start salivating, right? I start getting that Pavlov's dog of all of a sudden a bell rings and I start salivating because my body is in preparation for those things to come into my body and for me to digest that. Not to mention the other response around that is it starts secreting insulin, it starts secreting dopamine, it starts secreting a lot of other effects along with that. Now, why that is important, so when I digest those foods, whether it have a certain amount of calories or not, is the hormonal response around that is what's going to also drive the machine and create a domino effect of other things that are going to happen. All right. Now, why that is important is because if we're simply just counting calories, okay, if we're simply just counting calories, we'll use two different examples for this. So if I'm counting calories and I'm eating 400 calories of a cupcake, all right? So on average, depending on what you're cooking with, whatever, but on average, let's say a medium-sized cupcake is 400 calories. And we're going to compare that to an apple, all right? Now, an apple, same thing, depending on the size, depending on the brand, say it's on average about 90 calories, all right? So if I'm having, and I'm consuming both those products and both those things, but I'm essentially looking at on a calorie count based off of MyFitnessPal or whatever else I'm calculating that on, is when I digest those things, if I'm just looking at my calories, I can be getting 1,500 calories and eating essentially 4 cupcakes throughout the day, which is going to be eliciting, say, 1,600 calories, all right? Now, in order for me to get the same equivalent calorie count based off an apple of just having a simple medium-sized cupcake versus how many apples I'd have to essentially have almost 4.5 apples for every cupcake that I would have, right? So the quantity of food is completely different, right? Like how would you say that you could probably eat 4 cupcakes to elicit 1,600 calories pretty easily, right? Like, yeah, that wouldn't be any problem at all. But in order to do that, you would essentially need what? 4, 8, 12, 16, almost 24 apples throughout the day to get the same equivalent, or it's even more than that, equivalent of 1,600 calories. Now, what happens there is not only on the aspect of do you think you could actually consume that? No, but the reasoning behind that is because your body has certain mechanisms that actually turn off that drive that effect, right? Like there's a hormone leptin in our body that controls whether or not that tells us to turn off that signal of, hey, you've had enough to eat. You're done eating, right? Where I could eat 4 cupcakes, no problem, but what's the likelihood that I can sit down and eat 24 apples? Very, very little, if at all, right? Like that signal in my brain is going to tell me, hey, you know what? We don't need any more. You met your limit. You're done for the day. Same thing. There's a hormone ghrelin that controls my hunger response on there that tells me whether or not I'm still hungry or whether I'm not. I still need to consume food. So when I'm digesting based off of calories, those markers don't necessarily understand how to come into play. And so it's understanding that, yet again, even by my interpretation of what's going to come in, as I digest that food and as it enters my stomach, that's going to create a different response based off of the nutrients that is based around that food. So my hormonal and my digestive response based off of whether I'm having a cupcake or whether I'm having an apple is also going to elicit different things. So when I go and it digests into my stomach, then it goes into my liver where it has to be detoxified and sent back into my stomach, or been sent back into my sent back into my intestines. Now what happens there is if I'm having processed foods via cupcake, sugars, processed foods, I may have a food allergy, I may have other things on there. What happens is once my body is overexposed to those things, what happens is those processed foods, those sugars, other things that are happening internally starts actually breaking down my intestinal wall, the wall that basically protects my inside system. It protects me from the food and stuff that I'm eating. Now what happens is because of processed foods, sugars, stress, undersleep, other external environments, pollution, all the other things that get involved into our systems that actually pokes holes in our lining of our intestinal wall. You may have heard this, it's called leaky gut. Now, why that's important is once those food particles or other proteins and other stuff start secreting into my body starts seeing those as foreign enemies, and it actually starts attacking that's where inflammation comes from, and that's where my body starts creating antibodies to start attacking those things, and that's when our immune system starts to become compromised, because 70% of our immune function is coming from my gut, my kidneys, and other aspects of that. But when that leaky gut starts to coming in, because of, yet again, it's not just the calories I'm consuming, it's the products that I'm consuming along with that, is compromising my immune function. Now, what also happens with that is if my immune function is compromised in my gut, that is also going to probably elicit inflammatory response in my brain. The gut is also known as your second brain, and so if this gets compromised, this also starts to get compromised, and because it goes back and forth. The vagus nerve that attaches from your stomach to your brain, it's kind of a direct pathway. They go both directions. So if this gets compromised, this also leads to compromised function. Now, why is that important? Because if your brain gets toxic and inflamed, that also leads to anxiety, depression. 90% of your serotonin, the chemical and the hormone that makes you happy, feels joyful, is secreted in your gut. Now, yet again, if there's compromise there due to inflammation, that's also going to compromise the feeling of joy, your cognition. You may have brain fog. You may have other things going on. There's a new term being called type 3 diabetes, is also basically being linked to dementia and other things and other related aspects of brain function. So yet again, if I'm basing everything I'm doing based off of calories, I can have 1,500 calories, 1,600 calories, and that's all I'm predicted to need for the day to elicit whatever I'm trying to respond. But if I'm having all these other detrimental effects based off of the things that I'm eating, I'm going to have other things that are being affected by that. Not to mention the thing that most people aren't necessarily aware of or even talk about, is the governing system that basically controls your metabolism and other aspects of your body. And so what's controlling that is your hypothalamus, your thyroid, and your adrenal. Now, why this is important, because yet again, if those two systems are compromised, if my system in my gut is compromised and my system in my brain is compromised, the governing system that controls essentially my immune function, my body temperature, my sexual function, my overall just metabolism, is my hypothalamus. Okay, now it's a small little almond-sized little portion in your brain. Now, why that's important is because that controls your body temperature, that controls, like I said, your sleep, your blood level function, your body temperature, your metabolism, and there's a portion that gets all connected, which is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Now, why that is important is because your hypothalamus connects your nervous system and the immune, and essentially those two systems. So it connects your endocrine system, which is essentially your hormonal function, and your nervous system. Okay, now why that's important is because your hormonal function is what sets you up. Okay, so that's like your insulin that secretes other functioning aspects on there. But why that's important is, so if these, like I said, if these two components are compromised, the signal that gets sent from my stomach that, hey, you have cupcake in your system, you all of a sudden now need to release insulin, you need to secrete certain other functions on that. What happens is it's kind of like the game of telephone, right? Like you're sitting with six of your friends, and you may say, Sally Joe is the most amazing person. You may whisper it in one of your friends' ears, and then all of a sudden the message gets carried down the line, and before you know it, the person at the end of the line is essentially interpreting that like Sally Joe is the worst person ever, right? And so the message gets misconstrued and gets kind of misinterpreted, and when it gets to the point of the hypothalamus, all of a sudden that message gets misinterpreted, and so it starts firing and not firing certain functions on that. Now, why that's important, because your hypothalamus talks to your pituitary gland, which also talks to your thyroid. Now, your thyroid's important because it also governs your Your cortisol deals with your thyroid hormone, which secretes a lot of functions surrounding your metabolism and other governing bodies around that. Not to mention when I'm talking about my adrenal system. Okay, so your adrenals is a little peanut thing that attaches essentially on top of your kidneys. Now that secretes cortisol, and essentially it's your fight or flight system. Now based off of your external, essentially your interpretation of your external environment, that's via your nervous system. So and not just if my interpretation is off via I feel overstressed, my boss just told me I have to stay late, I get in an argument with my spouse, I'm in a fight or flight of I just dodged death, whatever it may be, my external world is also affecting my internal world. So yet again, if I'm just basing everything off of calories, but my reaction to my external world is I'm in constant stress, that is also telling my kidney or the adrenals on my kidneys to produce a lot of cortisol. Now, when I'm producing a lot of cortisol, I'm in constant fight or flight, meaning my cortisol levels are at a super high, which also means I can't turn off and I can't essentially take out any sugar in my blood because the insulin levels won't be able to do their job. And so, and again, if I'm just basing that off of calories, but all these other systems are in just constant flux, it doesn't matter what my calorie count is. If my system's inflamed, that's also going to cause other things on there. Not to mention the last thing why this is important, because if your system's inflamed, your interpretation of stress or whatever's going on there, if my body's not flushing out those toxins and flushing out that stress or flushing out the toxins of via inflammation, via toxicity of whatever I may be eating, consuming, drinking, breathing, whatever may be going on there, if my body's not actually flushing, my other response to that in order to cool that, so your inflammation is hot, right? Like if you're basically got a cut and all of a sudden it feels really warm, or you have a temperature when you get sick, that's inflammation. That's your body's automatic response to trying to essentially put out that fire. Now what happens when your body senses that internally it can't it can't flush those things out, what happens there is your body, as a mechanism to try to put out that fire, secretes fat. It secretes more fat to go around the cells that are essentially inflamed, that are causing that heat, in order to cool them down. Now the problem there is also, in lieu of those fat cells going around that, because your body's trying to produce more fat to actually buffer that system, is I think there's 15 hormones that are based around that. Well, I'm sorry, there's 17, but 15 of those hormones in white fat cells also secrete more fat. And so in lieu of that, when I secrete more fat, there's also more inflammation going on, which secretes more. So my body starts creating this kind of just domino effect of trying to protect itself, because your body's always trying to work for you. But because we see that as just, yet again, calories in, calories out, well, I've been doing this, I should be eliciting this. It's important that we understand that all these functions all these systems that are within our body are functioning and governing together. And if we're just basing our environment based off of what we're eating internally on a calorie portion, it's not going to elicit long-term sustainable success. Trust me, you can restrict your calories, you can do those things for a short term. We've done that for years. We're doing this for 20 years. You can do that for a short term, but on a function of long-term sustainable health, it hasn't been shown to work that way. Because yet again, if there's a body set point, there's a lot of other things that go through this, but it's more important, it's more vital to understand that your body's functionality is made off of a lot of different other systems, and more importantly, based off of nourishing your body, as opposed to just giving it, whether or not you're giving it X amount of gas to drive to whatever location you're trying to get to next. So hopefully this paints a little bit different picture. I know this probably opened up a lot more doors for you to maybe have to search through, but that's why it's not just based off your calories. There's way more of a systematic and synergetic approach that when it comes to your overall health and wellness and accomplishing your goals, than just based off of what the normal simplistic way of going about it is. And it is very simple, right? When you kind of learn these things, you can go about this in a different standpoint, but there's a lot more that is unknown than what we would like to give credit to. So hopefully this helped. Let me know if it didn't. I appreciate your time. Take care.